Okay, the stream is start. So I will return the room for the chair and the volunteer. Thank you all.
Hi, okay, thank you very much. So I think roll call was done and all judges and debaters are here. So I'll just do a very brief introduction. I'll be doing the timekeeping for this round. So I'll be doing timestamps at 1, 7, 8, and 8:15 for substantive speeches, as well as 3, 4, and 4:15 for reply speeches. If a debater lags out or suffers delay in their speech due to connection problems, I will adjust the timekeeping just to be a bit more equitable and fair to the debater. All active debaters during the round, as well as judges, are highly encouraged to keep their cameras on at all times. So it's easy for me to see you and attend to you in case anyone drops out. In the event someone does drop out, I will stop the clock and interfere with the debate just to let everyone know that there has been a technical problem. At the beginning of your speech, debaters, please indicate your POI preference, i.e. how you prefer to receive a POI, be it verbally, visually, or through the chat. In the meantime, I would like to invite both teams to just input their speaker order in the Zoom chat, please. Right, okay, got it. Thank you very much. Could Team Australia turn on their cameras before we start the debate? Just so that everyone can turn on their cameras and I know that we're all here. Oh, they're turning on, okay, great. So in the event that you have to turn on your camera because of connection problems, that's fine as well, just please let us know. Non-speaking observers or anyone not active in the debate, team coaches, managers, please turn off your camera and your microphones just so that we do not interfere with the flow of the debate. Before we start the round, I'd just like to ask the chair, would you like me to do the transition between speeches or would you like to do that?
If you could do that, please feel free to go ahead. I think
no worries.
Smoother.
Yeah, no worries, I can do that. Okay, so there's nothing else. I'd like to call the House to order and I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to open the debate. Here.
Can everyone see?
There's a lot of echo. Is there something you can do about that?
How do I increase the sound? Yeah. Can everyone see me and hear me now?
Yes, now it's very clear. Good.
Okay, thank you. I prefer to take POIs verbally. In the age of a digital world, your data has become analogous to your physical safety. Individuals fall victim to companies like Robinhood paying you $1 a month when it only leads to the exploitative use of data, when individuals can never know where their data ends up and what it is used for, when it actively undermines the hard and long-fought journey we have embarked to ensure individuals engage in online activities safely. The critical issue we have to answer in this debate is which side protects the user's privacy and choice that is prone to infringement and exploitation. Our response is that users selling their data is a euphemism for the exploitation and extreme infringement of privacy that is inherent to allowing companies to pay you to access your data. And Team Hong Kong absolutely will not condone this. 4 arguments we will run. In my speech, 1, why this choice is actively exploitative. 2, why it actively undermines privacy. 3, why it actively is unjust because it causes negative externalities. And 4thly, in Jenna's speech, why you cause a monopolization of the tech industry. Before that, our model. We are fine with the status quo, i.e. when Facebook does have access to parts of your data. In the status quo, there are obviously loads of regulations about what data companies can have access to. However, it is crucial to recognize there is a difference between selling your data and the status quo we are proposing on our side. What are the differences? We think when you sell your data, here are what things companies can exclusively do. They can sell your data to third parties. They can get more specific data, i.e. your medical data, your relationship or socioeconomic status, data from other platforms, biometric data, i.e. Apple can sell the photo you use for your face on their firms, virtually anything you can think of. Generally, these are more specific and personal data, and the more specific and personal it is, the more beneficial it is for companies. No, thank you. First argument, why is this choice exploitative? Our premise is that a coercive choice may not be bad, but a coercive choice that is exploitative is bad. If I force you to take $50, it's coercive, but no one will think that is bad. If I'm forcing you to give me $50, that becomes actively harmful and exploitative. Being able to sell your data for a small return per month pushes people to make bad choices when they are unable to make informed and good decisions. We protect individuals when the choice is actively harmful and exploitative. So the question becomes, why is this choice to sell your data exploitative? This is true for about 3 reasons. 1, because of information asymmetry. The average person probably does not know too much about the tech sphere or what happens to digital data. It is unclear where your data goes, who receives it, when your data is monetized, or when your data is sold to third parties and companies. Once you sell your data, you have lost complete ownership of it. This is irreversible, and you do not know the parameters in which your data will operate in. You no longer can control where it goes because companies are not able to sell it to third parties however they like. But B, because in general, no one really reads the 19-page long terms and conditions written in microscopic fonts to check all the rules of the information in which they're sharing. We already see this in the status quo, but we think it's far more coercive and harmful when you are not able to monetize your data. But C, we think in many cases, people have a short-term gain versus indefinite long-term harm belief. I.e., if I sell my data now, I don't really know where my data goes or what happens. It seems to me the harm is not very obvious, but I do know each year I can earn about $20. That seems like a decently attractive deal to make, and most people will definitely opt into this. That we think that is actively harmful. But what is even more harmful is that there's a collective action problem, where if only you yourself are selling your individual data, that probably isn't too big of a problem. It only becomes a problem when everyone else is doing it as well, because that is when data and big data becomes useful. This means that you actively leave people behind when you force all individuals to tend to give up data because of the network effect. Because for opposition to have any tangible impacts, they need to have the vast majority of people selling their data in order to make big data and proper analytics. This normalizes data selling on their side. It becomes more likely that many services will be contingent upon giving up privacy, not just from social media companies like Facebook and Spotify, but potentially crucial financial services, i.e. having a reasonable interest rate bank account or access to retirement saving advertising. These are actively harmful. This means that the most vulnerable people, those who probably do not want to sell their data, some people who have a past they would like to forget about, people who they no longer want to associate with their lives, these are not the people who either shut out from essential services entirely, or they're more pressured to surrender the privacy they hold, as these are the individuals that will fall victim to the system. Therefore, you actively undermine choice for other people. Why is this so harmful? 1, because companies are able to sell it to third parties, i.e. you are able to sell data to companies that do facial recognition. That can actually be sold to the police, the state, and many surveillance agencies. Why is this so dangerous? In the worst of states, you can use it for surveillance and active oppression, i.e. many Chinese companies are already selling data to government surveillance agencies to monitor minority groups. But even in countries that aren't fully authoritarian, states could still use it in select situations to arrest and identify protesters. We think in general, the harm is too great to be absorbed. But compared to the status quo, why are we better on our side? Because we think even if your data can be circulated, there are heavy regulations that protect you. And regulations are in fact already improving in many countries as companies like Facebook are receiving higher standards of scrutiny. But on their side, once you sell your data, it is no longer yours. The parameters as to where your data circulates never becomes clear because it can be sold to any party on their side. You lose control over your data. Therefore, the conclusion of this argument is that exploitative choices are unjust and actively harms people when they're unable to make informed choices. Before I move on to my argument, I'll take a POI.
Do you support people getting paid for things like professional wrestling or boxing?
If their concern is about bodily autonomy, we say on our side, your access to your rights actively infringes on other people's rights and causes massive harm. That is non-analogous. Second argument, why you undermine privacy and worsen regulation. The premise of this argument is that privacy protects you. It is important because it is part of your identity. It is part of who you are and your fundamental right to yourself as to how much you want to expose. The mechanism is why does it mean that it's actively undermined on their side? Because what does the status quo look like? Often when you have regulations, you are absolutely prohibited to sell data to third parties. Even if Facebook can use your data for advertising, they're never able to sell it out of their current company. These are rules that you can set up. If companies companies violate them, you can punish them retrospectively and enforce deterrence. You can advocate for better regulation. This looks like a lot of class action lawsuits that already happened against Facebook. Advocacy is based on the fact that it is your data. It highlights the idea of consent. It is based on the idea that companies are massive and are exploiting you. The comparative on their side is that you now lose the ability to advocate when companies have bought the data, when regulations are already circumvented and broken. They have sacrificed huge amounts of money to create that business model of selling and using data. If you try to tell them that they need to change it, they're not able to act against you because you have already given up your consent and given up the idea of protection. The conclusion of this argument is that 1, you have decreases in regulation. This looks like the regulation of not selling information to third parties, which is often massively harmful. But 2, it is difficult to get future regulations, i.e. when you are able to sell things like biometric data, facial recognition, AI for things like to calculate rates and calculating who to give mortgages to. This means it's far more harmful. The harm is actively magnified when you sell and monetize your data. Quickly on the third argument, why does selling your data lead to negative externalities on others? The premise of this argument is that your data is closely tied and connected to others. Selling your data means you're also selling other people's data without their consent. That is unjust and actively harmful. You have violated a choice that someone else rightly owns. Why is this true? Is inherently linked to other people. If my location information is sold, it shows me at my partner's house. That tells you how much about them as it is to me. Structurally, because of how interdependent we are to each other and how we use technology in all circumstances, such as in our relationships, in group meetings, with our family, our data must feature information about someone else. This is bad for reasons because 1, there's a non-consensual choice. Those are the individuals who have their data sold without your consent. It undermines any monetary benefit that opposition wants to get at. The more people have already sold their data because of the networking effect, the less and less you will be paid because companies essentially already have their data. There's a lesser demand for it. The conclusion is that we think data selling is not a matter of individual consent and autonomy. It is unjust because other people are equally harmed. Team Hong Kong refuses to allow exploitative companies to prey off individuals' identity.
I think the first proposition for that speech, I'd just like to check if all of the Team Hong Kong is here, because I think one of your devices for the other speaker dropped off.
Yeah, we're all here.
You're all in the same room, right? Because one of the devices dropped off, so I'm just checking. Right, okay, great, thanks. So thank you very much for this proposition. If the judges are ready, I'd like to call the next speaker. All right, great. Without further ado, I call the first opposition speaker to give the opposition case.
Hi, I'll be taking POIs in the chat, please. Assuming I'm audible, starting in 3, 2, 1. Team Proposition needed to get up here and tell you why they wanted to ban the selling of data collection, not just why it might be beneficial to regulate the data collection. Because the reality is they had to set up infrastructure that would allow for banning, that we actually thought we could repurpose for some of the regulation that might be beneficial. But ultimately, they needed to justify a blanket ban on this policy, not simply like give you some minor harms that could eventuate. This was a strategic failing of them, and it's something I'm going to analyze deeper in my speech. Firstly, 2 questions are set up. What do these exchanges look like? We think these exchanges operate on a scale, from cash-in-hand transactions for surveys on the street to companies offering discounts on products in exchange for data collection that might look like lifting a paywall, for example. Secondly, on our stance. Because for Proposition's policy to work, they need some means to regulate how companies collect that data. Clearly, their policy would be a failure if Google can keep flouting these guidelines and collecting data anyway for money. We would repurpose the infrastructure they need to set up to facilitate transactions and make sure that users could opt in and out of selling their data to these companies. To the extent that feasibility problems exist for one side of this debate, they exist for the other side. Lastly, we were more than happy to educate people on data issues and to force companies to state their data collection policies as part of our regulation. So firstly, on why people have the right to make this choice. Such a ban is illegitimate because in a capitalist society, your money is your autonomy. It's your ability to choose where you send your children to school. It's your ability to be free from starvation. It's your ability to provide for one's family. That is why we have very few restrictions on how people can earn money. We don't allow you to hurt others, but we do allow you to potentially incur enormous harms to yourself. People can work on high voltage power lines, on deep sea oil rigs. That danger is rewarded by providing them a greater income. We even allow people to physically exert themselves to the point of collapse and pay them millions of dollars in athletic contracts for doing so. Proposition must justify their ban not only by proving why it might be bad, but by showing that it is so bad that we should never allow anybody to engage in this practice for money. The damage that selling your data does, however bad it may be, is so much less than a series of 13 concussions that we allow athletes to incur under the status quo. For that reason, it is utterly illegitimate to ban people from making money because of these minor and speculative harms. But even if you believe that Proposition presented you major harms, notice the major harm that they provided you was surveillance potential that could be used by police, that could be used by oppressive regimes. Firstly, plausibly, we think you're probably not going to exercise your principled right to make this choice and sell your data if you regularly attend illegal protests in your country, if you regularly commit crimes and the police are looking for you. But even if you were going to make that choice, it might indicate that this is a worthwhile decision for you. Maybe that money was helping you fund your protests. Maybe it was funding your airline ticket out of your oppressive regime. Proposition didn't have a right to make an assertion that that choice wasn't beneficial for you in the long run. Secondly, on why we benefit individuals. I want to take a step back and analyze why this debate has emerged. Before that, I'll take that point.
Selling your data also sells your spouse's location data and data from a similar demographic to you without compensation to them. Is this an active hurt and harm to other people?
I mean, if you're living with your spouse, presumably your finances are connected, so they are going to benefit by you having more money. Like, that's generally marriages have joint finances. I'm not quite sure how you can make the link that people don't benefit from their spouses making money, considering jobs also work that way. So this debate emerges because of a crossroads in the status quo where people increasingly care about their data and where it's going, but that is now threatening traditional profit models of internet companies that rely on advertising, that rely on data collecting and selling for the free provision of services. This looks like the majority of social media platforms like Facebook, like Instagram, like Snapchat being free. It looks like Google financing YouTube at a loss, an open-facing video hosting platform that they could run because they could collect data from it. But as people are less willing to give over their data, and as governments begin regulating this industry, more and more of the internet lies behind paywalls, which bar consumers, especially those of low socioeconomic status, from entry. Why is this damaging? Firstly, there is a massive congregation of information on the internet that is used in mundane tasks like cooking recipes to more important decisions like information on politicians for voting. Secondly, people use services like Google Maps to find their way around the city. And thirdly, platforms of social media like WhatsApp and Facebook are vital means of communication for people. But as these platforms sink behind paywalls, consumers are no longer able to access them unless they are willing to pay expensive subscription fees. Note that under the status quo, under side opposition, platforms could afford to keep themselves free because they were able to collect data from internet traffic. So why did we resolve this? Because we allowed for people to opt back into original profit models where they exchanged data for access that was serving them very well. Additionally, we were able to regulate malicious data collection such that consumers can opt in and out of it, which co-opted a lot of the proposition's material on things like coercion. This allows individuals to access platforms that are becoming slowly unavailable. It allows them to access news that is vital for being informed and make democratic decisions. It allows them access to educational content on YouTube, access to services like Google Calendar for their scheduling, access to communication methods that help them foster relationships. But as subscription models emerge, selling data in exchange for money used to pay for those subscription services is a means of financial compensation for that data. As time progresses, however, it is likely that you see individuals able to sell their data more directly, like selling their search history to Google for fixed monthly rates, for selling their location data for the past month in exchange for Facebook shares. This was additionally a massive benefit in this debate because it forms a means of passive income for individuals that don't use the internet either way. This was a way that they could pay for their daily essentials. It could help them pay rent. It could contribute to their savings for larger financial security. Proposition could not run away from how drastically important money was for people's lives in this debate. Thirdly, on why data collection is actually good, because notice how the entirety of Proposition's case hinged on the analysis behind data collection being exploitative and bad. But we can flip this because users massively benefit from data being collected for them personally. Firstly, because it personalizes the internet for them. This is the reason for the popularity of platforms like TikTok that are able to deliver personalized content about things that people actually care about. But secondly, it allows for advertising that caters to people's wants and desires. Companies can generalize and use your personal information to determine what products you actually want. That means you get a constant comparison of things you want to buy, greater competition because you see the best prices and qualities available, and just generally, people enjoy looking at the products that are targeted towards them that they actually want to buy. This also meant that daily conveniences were much more accessible to people because now applications could use their location data to show you how far you walked today, to show you the weather for the correct location. These were all things that operated exactly within companies wanting to optimize their products so that consumers liked them, so that they could make profit. This was the strongest reason those companies had and the reason why this data collection was being used broadly for these positive purposes. These were things that made people's lives easier. This occurs every single day to millions and millions of people across the world. It might be easy for proposition to try and dismiss these impacts, but these made people's lives less tedious, less difficult, and far more fun. It was a massive impact on their standard living, of their quality of life, and it affected so many more people than their policies. Proud to oppose.
I thank the first opposition speaker for that speech. If the judges are ready, I'll invite the next speaker. All right, I'd like to invite the second proposition speaker to continue the proposition case.
Hi. Okay. So I'm Jenna. My preferred pronouns are she, her, and I would like my POIs to be verbal. Okay. If you want to talk about the power of data, let's talk about Cambridge Analytica, because the issue with that was when Facebook decided it could sell your data because it was theirs and then use it to corrupt and perverse what was once called the strongest democracy in the world. Some argue that because of that Cambridge Analytica scandal, you didn't have a fair and true 2016 election. This is the true power of data. It's not that your TikTok content is a little bit better and a little bit more personalized to you. When data gets really bad, it empowers surveillance states and it corrupts democracies. 3 sections to rebuttal before moving into our final piece of substantive on why on their side of the house, they increase power of the largest corporations in a truly toxic way. Firstly, let's talk about choice, because they argue that people are able to do things pretty much whenever they want, which is why we let people do things like box and wrestle. So let's talk about preserving people's autonomy, because we also have things like seatbelt laws where we say it doesn't harm anyone else for you not to wear a seatbelt. It is purely for your own protection. But even then, we require you to wear a seatbelt because it preserves your future autonomy. Because if you die in a car accident, that removes all of your future choice. We also argue no one would rationally choose to not wear a seatbelt. People do it out of carelessness and negligence instead of actually thinking that I get some sort of benefit from not wearing a strap across my chest. So the way up of freedoms here, the cost versus of not wearing a seatbelt versus wearing a seatbelt is so massive that the government says, sure, we're sacrificing parts of your freedom, but we don't really care because we would much rather everyone wear a seatbelt and have that as an enforceable rule. So the question of choice really then becomes a question about weighing up the costs and benefits of selling your data. Let's talk about the benefits opposition wanted to talk about then. They argue that you're going to get some money. Sure, that may be true. We would tell you this is probably going to be on an individual's basis, very, very little money, right? We're talking about, if they want to talk about like lowering paywalls, the amount of money that you pay for a Spotify prescription, perhaps. If we're talking about money, this certainly isn't going to be enough money to change your life drastically. It's certainly not going to supplement your income in a major way. If this is the cost we're talking about, we're more than happy to concede it. On top of that, they wanted to talk about people being able to access content behind a paywall. Let's remember, YouTube is free right now. TikTok is free right now. These are all platforms that don't exist behind paywalls. The only people who want to pay for a paywall and access that content are people who really care about their privacy, i.e. people who on their side of the house aren't going to be selling their data anyways. So really their benefits on their side of the house are truly marginal, other than, yeah, you get more personalized TikTok. So the stance then is also that we can also do that too. I think Madeline was pretty clear when she identified the difference between the status quo and selling your data. The status quo, TikTok and Facebook and YouTube can collect some of your data can use that to make algorithms that make your data nicer for you, and that like make sure that you have like the best, most optimal Instagram feed for your own pleasure. That's all great. We can claim that benefit as well. The difference is they cannot sell your data to third parties without your consent. They must check all their decisions on what they do with that data outside of the realms of that company and the service that they're providing for you. That is essential, because that is when you actually allow people to do things like opt in and opt out. That is when you allow people to decide that my data is going to go to something that directly benefits me, instead of letting other people make that decision for you. On their side of the house, they have to live in a world where Facebook can sell your data to Cambridge Analytica, and they have to be okay with it. So that is a specific harm here. And we don't think that you can back out of this as they try to model out, because once that data is sold to Facebook, if they sell it to someone else, you can't get that back. You can't go to their servers and delete that data. They have already made that transaction. On their side of the house, there is no opt-out mechanism that doesn't reverse the damage, the massive damages that have already occurred. We also don't think that their models of like have more transparency and have more education are really going to work. A lot of people, particularly people who aren't like teenagers who grew up with technology to begin with, particularly people who are middle-aged and older, just won't understand how valuable their data is to them, won't understand what the algorithm is or what an algorithm is to begin with and what it's doing. We don't think any amount of transparency is going to help. People aren't going to realize the consequences of doing this action. As Madeline told you, this is the problem with the idea of choice, because one person selling their data really doesn't do much. No one is scrambling to buy one person's data. But the issue is when you have companies that have billions of users' data, that's really valuable. So it's not one person makes a choice, it's everyone makes a really bad choice. And so the amount of transparency and education doesn't make a difference, because transparency just lets you see, oh, it's not that bad as long as I'm the only one doing it. They don't see the broad scale trends that are going to occur, especially people who aren't as technologically literate or technologically advanced. I'll take that point.
The policy you are trying to ban is the exchange between a consumer selling their data to a company, not a company selling any data they might collect to another company. Since you concede that companies collect data under your side, how do you prevent that selling to a third party?
A company sells, if you sell your data to a company, they now own it. They can do whatever they want with it, including selling it to other people. On our side of the house, they can collect your data, but they do not own it because you did not sell it to them, which is why in most companies in the status quo don't let you sell your data to a third party, which is why Cambridge Analytica was such a scandal, because it was illegal. So on their side of the house, they have to contend with a world where companies can sell your data to things that are going to prop up facial recognition. They say, yeah, just don't sell your data if you're a regular protester. You know what? If everyone else is selling their data, that facial recognition technology gets really good. Even if you don't sell your data, they will find you anyways. On top of that, saying that because you sold your data once, 10 years down the line, when you decide that you want to protest for something, I guess you should have thought harder about it 10 years ago, is a pretty poor response to a surveillance state. The idea that that was their only response is pretty appalling on their side of the house. Secondly, then, we told you that on our side of the house, we're going to get better regulations for the future. Line of analysis, they never actually touch. The idea that on their side of the house, once you've sold that data to someone else, it becomes really, really hard to tell companies that they have to be socially responsible with that data. It becomes really, really hard to push for regulations that we might not even know we need in the status quo. Regulations around, for example, biometric data, regulations around whether or not you can sell your data to AI black boxes. These are all regulations that are kind of shady right now because no one really knows what that technology is. On their side of the house, once that data has been sold and you give companies free reign to do it, they do not have to check with their consumers and with their users before selling that data. They can go ahead and do it. At best, if they get regulation, it is retrospective instead of preventative, and the harm exists anyways. But lastly, then, on the idea of others' consent, and they tried to sell this off as like your spouse's benefit too. That's not the point. If your spouse did not consent to selling that data, it doesn't matter if you think they benefit. If they don't think that that benefit is worth it, you've taken their consent away from them. If they value autonomy, they should certainly value that. Lastly, then, on why opposition increases the power of the largest corporations. And we think that data is the oil of the future. Letting certain companies take control of it entrenches existing power hierarchies and crushes a truly free market. And we think that large corporations will be buying and selling most of the data because they have the most number of users, the most access to that data in the first place, and the most amount of money to make good deals to buy massive amounts of that data, right? We think this is incredibly harmful because it means they can sell data to other companies that they have stakes in or spin off branches, right? So Apple collects health data from the health app and the Apple Watch. They can sell that data to health tech companies that they have shares in, or they could potentially set up their own. Data is a massive head start in that sense, and it creates a super uncompetitive market, right? The impact of reducing competition is that initially it might look like it's okay. It might look like you're getting better services, but the harm is in the long term. When companies are so advantageous and so competitive that they get a majority market share, or at least a substantial amount, that is when they have a chokehold and they can start raising their Once they have a monopoly, they have no incentive to innovate in the future. If you sacrifice that monopoly in a truly free market in the short term, it's going to lead to harms in the long term. We don't think antitrust regulations are going to be enough because it's going to be retrospective and it is harder to break up a massive company than to prevent it from forming in the first place. But also because companies will have invested billions of dollars into buying your data. If this is their model for paying their shareholders back, they're going to resist all and any attempts to try to break it up and prevent them from doing that. On their side of the house, these services that we rely on for future medical equipment, for making sure that our retail stores are being able to provide us good products that we rely on and need at fair prices. On their side of the house, they would sell that out because at least right now you are a little bit more comfortable. We would never sacrifice that for our futures.
I thank the second proposition speaker for that speech. If the panel is ready, we'll invite the next speaker. Okay, we'll invite the second opposition to continue the case for side opposition.
My pronouns are he or they. Can I please have POIs in the chat? And assuming everyone can hear me, can I please start in 3, 2, 1. If Cambridge Analytica was the example that side proposition wanted to point to, I think it was very unstrategic for them to support Facebook continuing to collect data under their side. Because Facebook didn't buy your data, they just sold it to third parties anyway. Side proposition has consistently argued a very compelling case for regulation of data selling, something that they cannot get if they do not allow this to be legal in the first place, because they have not provided a stable mechanism for why we are forced to sell to third parties and they are not. That is why none of their substantive material about third-party selling stands and why they consistently lose on every form of data in this debate. I'm going to answer a couple of questions. Firstly, is this a principled, is this a legitimate policy? Secondly, what are the impacts to individuals before I get into a substantive contribution on why they lead to more malicious data collection on side proposition? But beforehand, I just want to point out something in setup and stance. Because note that side proposition consistently supports the regulation and the collection of data. That is something that we are entirely able to do under our side. There is nothing stopping us making sure that there are adequate market rates. There is nothing stopping us forcing companies to not sell to third parties as is done with like the US, where they ban companies from selling to China. That is something that we can support under our side, particularly, note though, if they are using their fiat in this debate to actively ban the sale of data, that means that that is an entire market that you cannot regulate, because a government can never justify regulating something that they say is to be illegal. That is why, particularly in the instances where you continue to have the sale of data, only we can get regulation. Note how much side proposition has consistently argued that regulation is a good in this debate. Note at that point how much of their material we co-opt and we win on. Okay, on the first issue then. Is this a principled policy? Is this legitimate? Within this, they have 3 points. Firstly, that this is a coercive decision for you to make yourself and that it's exploitative. Secondly, that privacy is particularly important. And thirdly, that other people are likely to be affected. Note on the first one, they give 2 broad reasons as to why this is coercive and exploitative. They say, firstly, there is an information asymmetry. And secondly, they say that people have a short-term perspective. On the first, is there an information asymmetry? I think that firstly, note that information asymmetry is not a reason why we ban a vast majority of things in the status quo. I think that note that the vast majority of people that participate in very dangerous sports are not actually aware of the particular long-term effects that playing it when you're 7 years old can have on your brain 50 years later. I think that also fulfills the permanency that they want to talk about as well. I don't think information asymmetry is something that justifies banning. But even if it was, I don't think this information asymmetry exists. I think that we can just mandate that you have more education, but particularly I think that scandals such as Cambridge Analytica in the past have made people a lot more aware of data in the status quo. People investigate that a lot more. It's something people are constantly thinking about. I think this information asymmetry may have existed 5 or 10 years ago, but under the status quo where people are very concerned about this kind of thing, they actively do seek information out. It's something that does not exist. Secondly, on the short-term perspective, I think firstly, this is again untrue. People deeply care about data. I think that people are aware of it. But also, I think that short-term perspectives are often very justified. I think if you can get money out of this now, and that can help you right now, it is very justified. to trade off your long-term data safety if you can get a benefit out of that. I think that's a choice people do have the ability to make. I think they need to give a structural reason as to why it is literally impossible to consider the impacts rather than just say that some people are likely to prioritize one over the other. On the second point, they say that privacy is incredibly important. And the mech they try and use to do this is by saying that people are forced to wear seatbelts, even though there is no active, and you do not allow people to not. I think the first thing to note is that the reason they give for this is that there is no benefit from not wearing a seatbelt. That immediately proves why this is different. You get money out of this. That means there is a benefit to selling your data. I don't think that stands. But also, they haven't given a structural reason why privacy is an innate good. I think if someone actively chooses to opt out of their privacy in order to get something else, that is justified. On the third point, other people losing out, I think they still have not proven significant substantive harms as to why that is actively harmful. I think note the material we bring you, the fact that we allow people to incur harms when they get money out of it. We note that's why there are certain jobs that pay more, because they are damaging to your body. I think that's why very much it is legitimate to give people personal choice, particularly when we offer them compensation. We win on the principle. On the second point then, on the practical, they've only really given us two things here. Firstly, they've said surveillance technology can deeply harm people. Note, this is the vast minority of people in this debate. Almost no one actively lives in a situation where they are going out to protest compared to the number of people on the internet as a whole. That is to say that we can scale our benefits here. We can give every single individual on the internet a more personally targeted advertising and algorithm, and that is likely to, on net, improve their lives more so. Note that the small number of people in a surveillance state are also probably worse off under side proposition anyway when they still allow the collection of data. That's something that still exists. I think if that's a harm, they incur all of that as well. Note they also incur all the harms out of Cambridge Analytica as well, because they have not given an entirely structural reason as to why they cannot sell to third parties. Note the material that we bring on this issue that has not gotten a sufficient response. The fact that things such as paywalls are becoming more prevalent, that is why it is not justified to just say that the vast majority of sites under the status quo are not paywalled. They are becoming more and more paywalled. That's why YouTube is adding even more ads to the start of their videos. That means people are locked out from actively accessing important websites and data. That is particularly important for people who are not able to afford to go past paywalls on a constant basis. Note that you can get paid a significant amount of this. Even if in small subsets, this is a small amount, this can add up very quickly. You can get a lot of compensation. Before I go on, I'll take this POI.
Why would companies buy the data if they can get it for free right now and can't sell it to third parties on your side?
Oh, no, it's because at the moment, people are trying to avoid selling their data, but some people are likely to still be prepared to do that if they can get money out of it. That's why we're seeing the trends that we set up in first to no response. Okay, but note that there were also benefits of data collection. We give you all of these benefits. They agree that these are benefits and are still trying to ban people from being able to access, to have as much data. I think that means that we're able to win on all of that practical material. Lastly then, on to a second speaker point of substantive, why banning in particular is likely to lead to more malicious data collection. Note firstly, companies are always likely to continue to try and collect data. That is because they rely on it for their algorithms. They rely on it for their profit models. If they cannot do that, that's when they start setting paywalls. That means that if side proposition does not want people to start setting up paywalls for everything, they are likely to go into more malicious forms of data collection. What were the impacts of this? Note that the best case for side proposition was that they continue to buy, but in a market that is unregulated. That means that people cannot control rates. They cannot control where the data is going. Comparatively, under our side, we can offer government regulation. That transaction is something that can have checks and balances. That is a transaction that can be followed. It is something that people can be aware of. But note the inside proposition's worst case, and we think this is far more likely because companies are likely to try and avoid bypassing this buying mechanism. They are likely to actively turn to malicious means. That means more companies are trying to buy it from the third parties where you have absolutely zero control over the transaction at any point. You get absolutely no compensation for it. Note that that means that that is worse on all of the principled harms that side proposition tries to bring you at first, but also the practical harms because people are not getting any money out of this transaction. At the end of this speech, the important thing to note was that this was not just a debate about was data collection ever bad. It was firstly a ban regulate debate, and side proposition did not engage with the regulation that we are able to get that they can't. But secondly, it was about the fact that people can make an autonomous decision to collect money even if they incur a harm. That is something that people have the legitimate choice to do. Side proposition needs to respond, so proud to oppose.
I thank the second opposition speaker for that speech. If the panel is ready, I'll invite the next speaker. All right, let's hear from the third proposition speaker to end off the substantive portion of this proposition case.
Can I check that my audio and video are all right? Okay, thank you. I prefer verbal POIs and I use she, her pronouns. Opposition's case was we allow wrestlers to compete, so we allow people to sell data. We like nicer TikTok feeds and a couple extra dollars a month. So we will allow individuals to sell data infinitely to companies that they will never know of for causes that will remain unknown until massive harms are present. We told you all the way from first, data is analogous to your safety in the current age. When the choice of selling data is incredibly coercive, uninformed, and exploitative, we should never allow individuals to subject themselves to this transaction. 4 things I'm going to do in my speech. 1, what does banning data actually mean? 2, which side protects choice? 3, which side protects privacy? And 4, which side improves the technological industry? On to what does banning data actually mean? Because don't let Australia muddy the waters. It's very clear. We said that companies can still collect data, but this is the distinction. The data under our world is yours. The data is the companies in Australia's world. We said that regulation against data exists right now, even though it's not a transaction. This looks like the fact that you're unable to sell to third parties. It was simply asserted that you can't regulate something unless it's a transaction. We don't see why this is a case, but the example Jenna brought to you about Cambridge Analytica was that the reason why it's such a big scandal is because there were repercussions that were enforced afterwards, when lawsuits were brought up, when the companies had to pay. On to the first question then, which side protects choice? Maddie told you that the choice to sell your data is exploitative. And when choices are overly exploitative, you ban them, like selling your organs, like working below minimum wage. So instead of accusing us of not defending the ban, Australia should probably listen to our case. We said that we ban choices if you can't make the choice rationally and if there is massive harm. We told you that you can never clearly make the choice to sell your data. You lack information about the specifics of what will happen with your digital data because it's under the guise of technical jargon. Saying that you'll have more education and scandals bring awareness is not sufficient responses. We told you that when everyone around you uses the same networking and social media platforms, that you don't want to be shut out, that this is a collective action problem. No response to that. We also told you that your data is inherently linked to others, that the delineation of what is considered your own data is often unclear. Information about your financial status is indicative of your family's. Claiming that you might have a joint bank account doesn't take down this argument, and their lack of response is appalling when you don't consent to the third-party harm you're facing. They gave us 2 pushes. The first push was that people should be able to make a choice and it may be worthwhile. So for example, you allow people to make dangerous choices like workers, construction, or wrestling. We say that 1, we ban plenty of people from choices in the status quo because of the likely probability of harm. It might be worthwhile in some cases, but in majority of instances, it is not. This looks like banning people working below minimum wage. There can be benefits, but the harm of them doing so is far greater. But 2, don't let Australia get away with claiming that this harm is negligible. Maddie and Jenna told you very clearly in first and second that it's not about having a little more targeted advertising. It is about the potential for massive harm. Because even if it might not happen often, once it happens, it is irreversible. The fact that once you sell your data, you cannot control where it goes and you never processes it. We told you about third-party selling, whether that is to governmental agencies that can use it for facial recognition. It looks like the potential for selling your data to surveillance agencies, or it looks like lowering your socioeconomic conditions and promoting loan shark acts to poor people on Robinhood. This is all massively harmful. The second push they got from us was that money is beneficial, but we think that this is really laughable when Australia claims that someone who's economically struggling can now pay for their savings. This is unrealistic. The money you earn is probably going to be negligible. Think about the amount of users that use a single platform versus the amount of money companies are willing to pay. These platforms have millions of users they need to distribute costs across. What is the conclusion of this argument? Australia's glib responses were damning because we told you about why this is clearly exploitative, that measures like education don't get rid of the fundamental problem of the networking effect when you don't want to be shut out of these social media platforms. On to the second question then. Which side protects privacy? We told you that yes, the status quo is not perfect. We agree, but it's better than the world of Australia's. There are regulations right now, despite data not being a transaction, for data usages. And the reason for that is because data is still seen as yours and the consent is unclear. However, all of this is undermined in their world when the data is seen as belonging to the company. This is the comparative. This is not something that they can co-opt because Maddie made this very clear in her first speech to the difference. The only line of response about co-optation was lethal to Australia, and third is too late because this was debate winning. When there is a decrease in regulation because the data is no longer seen as yours, it is harder to get future regulation for problems we have not even begun to imagine yet. It looks like banking systems being able to use data based on the financial and purchasing choices to deny African Americans loans when you feed it within the algorithm. It looks like governments using your biometric data to jail political dissidents. It looks like facial recognition that targets people seen as a threat to the state. They gave us 3 pushes here. 1, they said that consumers will need to pay because you can't collect data. But we think that this just doesn't line up with reality because we say that currently most social media companies don't actually charge you. All of these companies understand that user traffic is probably important because it creates a network effect where everyone around you is using the same social media platform that increases further user traffic and increases a company's market dominance. But 2, fine, maybe YouTube has paywalls for YouTube Red, but it's still ultimately free. And 3, let's do some weighing here. We think that having to put up with slightly more ads or like a small paywall when there's going to be other free services because of market competition is something that is extremely negligible. We told you about the harm to privacy. Paywalls can't win this debate. This harm is something that we're perfectly willing to take on. But 2, they told us that personalized internet is positive. But once again, let's do some weighing here. We said that we're perfectly happy for you to do an extra Google search rather than have your right to privacy infringed when it means that you get targeted medical ads that are exploitative, when it means that you get links directing you to loan sharks because they know that you're economically unstable and thus more likely to take on those harmful loans. This is why privacy is important. For them to just push it off is not going to be enough. But we also say that secondly, internet personalization for large platforms are going to be symmetric. It's not an exclusive benefit. We said that companies can still collect data. The difference is you don't sell additional, more specific data to companies, and the companies cannot use that data for their other malicious purposes. But 3, they told us then that privacy is important. We told you from Maddie's speech that it is. It prevents the abuse of power. We agree, and we are the side that gets it. Before I move on, I'll take a POI.
How can you ever regulate an action that you have outlawed?
Because if you're found out to be doing that action, you literally face lawsuits. Your company will be put out of business. This is what Jenna and Maddie have been saying. You should probably listen to our responses. But thirdly, onto which side reduces the monopolization of the technology industry. Maddie told you that the largest companies have the most money to buy data. And this itself is debate winning because they have a chokehold on the industries. They have less incentive to innovate. They're going to do things like focus more on advertising and marketing of existing products rather than creating better products. This looks like companies like Facebook being able to go into alternate sectors like cryptocurrency and being able to monopolize those sorts of industries. This looks like the fact that they have now less market incentive to compete, to less market incentive to innovate. So this looks like the fact that they're going to be spending more money on doing targeted outreach, targeted advertising, as opposed to bettering the product. The fact that we didn't receive an adequate response from opposition was lethal because we told you that this doesn't just look like your right to privacy or your right to choice. This looks like the concrete impacts this has on the types of innovations humanity can get in the future. Australia's response was essentially really glib and really damning. And we think that the stuff Jenna brought to you about why this is critical for consumer innovation, critical for the future of humanity, was not responded to. This itself is debate winning. When you get better products because you don't have a monopolization, because big companies can't use their ultimate power of financial products to buy more data to get better marketing and advertising. This itself was debate winning, and this is what we get on our side. We told you that exploitation is exploitation, and Hong Kong protects choice and privacy.
I thank the third proposition speaker for that speech. If the panel is ready, we'll invite the next speaker. All right, let's next hear from the third opposition speaker to wrap up the substantive portion of the opposition case.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Excellent. Thank you. Give me 1 second. POIs in the chat, please. My name is Max. I use the pronouns he or they. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, if after 18 minutes of substantive, you are confused about proposition stance, welcome to the club. Because they want to, at the same time, have data collection given to corporations, but then not want these corporations to sell the data. That meant that the majority of their benefits in this debate were entirely symmetrical. Robinhood advertised to you on Facebook. Loan sharks are advertised to you on Facebook. If Facebook has that data, they are able to target those ads to you. To the extent that they wanted to have it both ways, then they copped the impacts of having it both ways. That meant that they made large portions of this debate entirely symmetrical if you bought that they could have collection but not be able to sell it. No, we tell you that they need to stop the collection of data because otherwise they cannot stop users from selling data to corporations if the corporations already have that data in the first place. That was the difference in this debate. They could not run away from their burden consistently down the bench, and they can't rectify that at AppReply now. We've pointed that out to you at every single speaker, and repeatedly they refuse to engage in a realistic conception of how this debate actually operates. But secondly, what did we tell you? We tell you that if they could stop the selling of data, that would mean that they would have massive amounts of infrastructure in order to stop that, because they have to know when companies actually had that data and where that data was going. If that infrastructure existed, we were happy to regulate that industry rather than ban it. To the extent that most of their benefits actually come from showing how you can regulate the industry, they don't win this debate because they prove exactly what we need to win this debate, which was that you needed regulation and not banning. They say you can just lodge lawsuits. Clearly, that's an indirect solution to the problem. If governments can regulate directly, that was always going to win us this debate in that instance. There are 3 questions worth considering at this stage. Firstly, on the question of the principle. Secondly, on whether data collection is itself bad. And finally, on whether if data collection is indeed bad, who wins consumers in this debate. But firstly, on the principle. Their principle came in 2 parts. Firstly, on the information asymmetry, and secondly, on the fact that you heard others, because it involves information about others. Notice that at the very, very beginning of their speech, they concede that this principle is entirely practically contingent, because they say that if you give $50 to somebody who does not consent to being given $50, if you give $50 to somebody who does not know that they will be given $50, then that was fine under their side of the house. To the extent that that is true, the burden was on them to prove that this was practically worse under their side of the house. So this was not actually a principle at all. It simply deferred the decision of this debate onto who wins the practical argument. However, we give you an active principle that wins us the debate under our side of the house, which was this, that the barrier to banning something in a capitalistic society that was able to earn you money was extraordinarily high. That was because money gave you autonomy in capitalism. It was what allowed you to put food on the plate so that you could opt out of things like starvation. It was what gave you agency to choose where you send your children to school and how you engage with society in the first place. That was what money could do for you. So we allowed you to sacrifice a lot of personal liberties in order to make money. That was why we allowed people to engage in professional boxing, where large men hit each other with boxing gloves until they remember no more. Clearly that was something that was terrible for you, and any impact that data collection could have on you was so minor compared to that. So unless they could meet that threshold, they could not justify banning something in this society. They don't refute that down the bench. Instead, they just keep giving you marginal impacts, like things like Cambridge Analytica, which, as Harry told you, was symmetrical anyway in this debate. So they needed to show you why this passed the threshold for needing to be banned. So then the burden in this debate is extraordinarily clear. They don't just need to prove that their side is marginally better on utility. They don't just need to prove that that data collection was marginally a harm. They need to prove that it was so large a harm that it would justify banning in the first place. Before I move on to the practical considerations in this debate, I'll take a point.
Facebook received major backlash and lawsuits for Cambridge Analytica because data selling is banned. Your side is the side that permits Cambridge Analytica without consequences. Will data be misused more or less likely on your side?
Correct. You are able to sue them because they are banned. You are also able to sue them because it is regulated. You are able to regulate for selling things like customer demographic data. You are able to regulate for selling things like racial demographic data. These are all things that you are able to regulate in selling. We gave you this material at first. If you don't respond to it down the bench, I'm really going to be surprised at what AppReply does now. So then the second consideration in this debate is data collection bad? Because notice, if we can show you that data collection is in fact a good in this debate, then the rest of the practical arguments that they bring you does not make sense. There's stuff on normalizing data selling. There's stuff on selling the data of others is all contingent on you buying that there is a trade-off in the first place. If we can show you that there is no trade-off, then we can win this debate outright. So what were the actual harms that they brought you to data selling? Because notice that they were incredibly speculative and unjustified in this debate. Firstly, they tell you that there are future speculative harms that you cannot currently conceptualize of. Notice that can be said of literally anything in the world, and like you have to pay that in a debate. Clearly, that's not enough analysis to get them over the line. Secondly, they tell you about surveillance states. Notice, like you have to ask yourself here, how big is the net change in this debate, and how much is a policy actually going to affect this? Because we tell you that Google and Baidu's data wasn't what was giving the Chinese government power over regulating protests on its western border. Instead, we tell you that the government was the one banning it. So to the extent that the person informing this policy was also the one abusing these individuals, they could not claim this was a benefit in this debate. The government wasn't going to regulate itself. The government wasn't going to ban the selling of data to itself. Clearly, that was an absurd push to make. Surveillance states were not a part of this debate because it is entirely symmetrical, because the government is not going to stop selling data to itself on their side of the house. But notice what we got onto our side, and this is why we flipped this claim, because we told you that through things like social media, which you were able to do things like organizing protests, through things like open sources of media that were not behind paywalls, you were able to gain media attention for your cause. These were all means by which protests could be more successful under these states and not less. That won us the question of surveillance states, and that flipped that argument. Secondly, they tell you that it corrupts democracies, and they just tell you about Cambridge Analytica. We tell you that that is insufficient in this debate. Cambridge Analytica was a failure in regulation because data was unregulated. Under our side, when we could regulate that data, we could also get that benefit. However, what did we tell you? And this is the stuff that gets no response, and this is why they actually lose this debate quite comprehensively. Because we told you firstly that data could be personalized, and that made your experience of the internet so much better. They try to wave this off just by saying it's just TikTok. Firstly, TikTok brings a lot of people a lot of joy in the world. Like clearly, like I genuinely think that it's a pretty big impact. Like you can have a pretty good time on the internet, and I reckon that's pretty cool. But secondly though, and far more importantly, they tell you that they can still collect this data, and that was their only response to this. That was an attempt to wash it. If they can collect this data, then clearly they lose on scale. Because if TikTok knows something about you, you probably also want Facebook to know something about you, so you can get the targeted advertising, and so you can get the benefits of personalization on that too. So if you bought their wash, then clearly we will decide that was able to bring you a far larger scale of impact. But secondly, we told you about paywalls. Their only response to this is, well, these paywalls aren't currently up, so why would they come up? That ignores the fact that we told you at first that this was a trend, that Facebook was operating at a loss, that YouTube was operating at a loss, that so many of these internet services were operating at a loss because increased regulations had come in about how much data they could actually buy off customers and how much they could actually sell that data. When you impose those things, that meant that the trend was towards more paywalls and people being unable to access things. That's why YouTube re-emerges out of a system that did not have it before. Why was that particularly important? Because it meant that you locked people out of Britannica, out of YouTube, out of the New York Times, out of the Guardian, and these were key sources of information to these people. The only way you got that back was by restoring the old models of profit on the internet, which was through the selling of user data, which only occurred under our side of the house. Notice at this point that we've flipped data collection. That data collection was objectively a good in this debate and not a harm. To that extent, none of their harms could actually accrue because they relied on a trade-off that did not exist. They relied on a trade-off that said that data collection was a harm, and they could not win on that front. So because of that, we tell you that all of their monopolization material also falls because of the fact that it relies on the exact same assumption that data collection is bad. For all those reasons, we're incredibly proud to stand on side opposition.
I thank the third opposition speaker for that speech. If the panel is ready, I'd like to next invite the reply half of the debate. All right, to end off the debate, let's first invite the opposition reply speaker.
Assuming I'm audible, starting in 3, 2, 1. The entirety of Proposition's case hinges on 3 specific claims. The first is that companies, when they collect data under their model, do not exploit that data. The data is only exploited when given to third parties. That secondly, they are actually able to prevent the selling to third parties under their side, and we are not. That thirdly, that the data collection and selling was harmful on net if and when it occurred. Firstly, on the claim that companies don't exploit data when they collect it, We told you that the example of, like the examples I wanted to give you about Cambridge Analytica didn't necessarily apply here. Importantly, they gave you no distinction between what constitutes a second party or data collector and a third party or someone the data is only sold to. Like presumably, Facebook can sell their data to a different party if they want to. Similarly, another party that collects data could sell it to Facebook. There was no characterization on why that actor would be more harmful in a situation than another when they allowed the data collection to occur. But secondly, and we told you this clearly at Max, that all the third-party examples that they gave you of being harmful were governments, and that they could never say that they could stop the government selling data to itself, that was symmetrical in both sides of this debate, and that they actually achieved nothing on that one front of harms they gave you. Secondly, they told you that they could actually prevent these third-party sellings from happening, even if they did prove to you that they were harmful. We told you clearly that they couldn't do that because you can't regulate an action that you have banned. So when you ban the actual collection of the data at the beginning, you can't then take a deeper dive, regulate the transactions that occur after that has occurred, because you necessarily, presuming you could detect data collection and selling, would have punished that already. Thirdly, the idea that the data collection on net was harmful. This is the thing I'm going to deal with most extensively in this reply. If you bought every single thing they gave you in this entire debate, then you believe that they, like their best case scenario was that they got rid of data collection and selling, that they didn't incur the harms they wanted to give you. We tell you that that was bad because data collection was actually good, that it personalized the internet for people, that allowed for catered advertising that meant personalized products, better prices and quality, better enjoyment of life, daily conveniences when your products were optimized. It secondly meant that that data provided access for you to like things that would otherwise be behind paywalls. That meant access to like vital methods of communication and information, access to educational content, services that made your life easier and facilitated important parts of your life that meant you could communicate and foster relationships. Their only response to this, like basically hinged on the fact that this was negative by saying that there would be negative externalities involved for people that didn't consent. Notice that hinges on the fact of it being negative. We say these are positive things, therefore we create positive externalities. That's just another reason why we were good. Notice why our benefits were more important than theirs. Because the majority of people in this world use the internet. The majority of people want to see recipes, they want to see the news, they want educational content, they want communication. Notice the severity of this as well, because every single day this benefit affected people, that it lifted their quality of life, that it changed their standard of living. And the likelihood of this was far more weighted to our side, because most people are not involved in data scandals. That's a tiny subset of the population. But almost everyone has data collected. If you buy data collection is happening under their side. Almost everyone has those positive externalities that multiply the effect. Almost everyone wants to use the internet, wants to buy products. That mattered so much more in this debate. But secondly, if you bought our analysis we gave you on why data collection didn't occur under their side, and if you didn't believe their mechanisms, then the only net change in this debate was money. Like if everyone's collecting data anyway, then they're not able to sell data on their side and they're able to sell it on this side. That money was massively individually beneficial for people. It affected a lot of people because there are lots of companies, there is lots of data in this world, that benefit spread everywhere and made so many people's life better, that it was a lot of money because both sides in this debate told you how valuable data was to people and therefore how much money they would get for it, that this was a guaranteed benefit in this debate because we supported selling your data, we supported people getting money. We gave you all the benefits that were important in this debate. Proud to oppose.
I thank the opposition speaker for that reply. If the panel is ready, I'll invite the next speaker. All right, so to conclude the debate as a whole, let's invite the government reply speaker.
Okay, cool. Here's the status quo. I have a Facebook account. I don't get paid by Facebook, but Facebook still collects my data, still runs algorithms on my feed, and can't legally sell my data to third parties. They tried to identify the increasing trend of regulation by post-Cambridge Analytica. We think that that's the path for the future. Let's not trade it for petty cash. Two questions then in this reply. Firstly, is this a valid choice? And secondly, let's do a harm benefit way. Firstly, is this a valid choice? Because we think that all bans on choice, firstly, are largely about weighing up the harms and benefits. So we think the second clash takes precedence over this anyways. For example, with a seatbelt, people are biased against the unlikely risk of getting a car accident. they make that choice out of negligence and just laziness. It is not a true choice. And the minor benefit of being a little more comfortable, having some freedom to not wear something really means a lot less than your safety in the vehicle, right? But we told you, we think that we win this case too, even if because we don't think that people will do the way up well. And we gave you multiple reasons for this. We told you most people are not tech wizards. Education and transparency, the two buzzword counter model they tried to run, cannot fix that. Some people are just too old and won't understand it. People don't have the time to understand complex issues. We also told you the consequences of this are going to be unclear because they're long-term, so people don't know what they're getting into. We told you that because these are long-term harms, it's also a collective issue. One person selling their data isn't that bad, but when everyone else does it for years and years, that's the problem. We told you on top of that, that there's massive pressure to opt into these things. They wanted to talk about paywalls. We talked about paywalls too. When we told you that if Facebook starts demanding that you sell the data to you, otherwise you can't use it, that is a massive amount of pressure for you to be able to access that data and for you to sell that data. So we told you this wasn't a valid choice. And other than that bit about information, they actually didn't engage with the 4 other layers that we gave you. But at the end of the day, so what? If you can't make this choice, we don't think the harms of that are all that bad. We gave you reasons why this probably wasn't going to be that much money, so that it's going to change your life, be able to provide food on the table. This wasn't income, right? So secondly, then let's do the way up on the harms and the benefits, because we told you there is massive harms to this. And the fact that they're long-term doesn't mean they're not real. We told you were going to get less regulation because in the status quo, you do have some, maybe imperfect, but you do have some regulations, like you cannot sell your data to third parties. And this is where it gets messy because Australia's whole case basically hinged on the sentence, you can only regulate something if it's a transaction. They never really explained why. We told you things are regulated right now. You do have to consent to terms and conditions. You do have to accept cookies on a website. You can't sell data to third parties. The fact is Cambridge Analytica was illegal. So the harms of not having that regulation then, we told you, was that you're going to sell it to third parties. They told you, we just won't let them. Let's firstly note that the regulations they talked about evolved throughout the debate and largely only came up in Op3, but also note, then why would companies buy the data? If they tell us that companies can get this data for free right now, why would companies pay an additional price for it so that they can continue doing exactly what they're doing? We think their response assumed that Facebook, Instagram, and Google were in some sort of data drought right now, which is just factually untrue, right? But also note that when Opposition 3 talks about additional regulations on the type of demographic data you were allowed to sell, it shows that they don't care about choice either, because they would limit your ability to profit yourself in the short term, a rational choice they argued, because they accept that there are long-term harms that outweigh it and are far more important. We told you the impacts of this are real, that we are able to regulate better, especially in the future when we are not sure what regulations we need right now, especially because if you don't regulate right now, after companies have spent billions of dollars buying that data, they're going to resist all regulations in the future. Both of these lines came up, both of them unresponded to on the regulation way up. But we told you it's not just surveillance states. The fact that police in half democratic states or half democratic countries are going to be using surveillance data as well. We told you this is going to harm the AI algorithms used for mortgages. It's going to mean that you have monopolies in major companies, including retail, to which, again, we got no response. It limits your freedom. It limits your future access to money. Australia trades off everything that they care about so that you can get behind a paywall, which we told you isn't going to happen right now. Chloe explained why it's not profitable for companies to do that, but also that the people who care about privacy aren't the people part of this debate. But lastly, that you can have a pretty good time on the internet. You know what? I value my freedom more.
I thank the proposition speaker for that reply, and that concludes the debate as a whole. Thank you very much for the team to the debate. I'd like to now invite the judges to retire to the deliberation room to work on the verdict. Thank you very much, everyone.
Hello, judges. I have